From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you here at the Library of Congress for what will be, I'm sure, a very interesting presentation discussion. I am Carolyn Brown. I am the Director of the Office of Scholarly Programs and of the John W. Kluge Center. And our guest speaker today is Dr. Neil Smeltzer, who has been with us in the Kluge Center for 3 months. I can't believe the 3 months are just about over, as the Kluge Chair of the Countries and Cultures of the North. Dr. Smeltzer is also Professor Emeritus of Sociology, University of California, Berkeley, where he spent most of his teaching career. I guess actually all of his teaching career. He also served as director of the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences in Stanford, California. Dr. Smeltzer is a Rhodes Scholar and later earned his doctorate in sociology from Harvard. He also, very interesting background, is a licensed psychoanalyst, licensed in the state of California, and has practiced from time to time. He has not practiced on us, as best we can tell. To my knowledge, right. I'm sure it's all very subliminal. He has written, as you would imagine, large number of books. I'd like to read you some of the titles because it does give you a sense of the breadth of his work. So among these are Economy and Society, written with Talcott Parsons, The Theory of Collective Behavior, The Sociology of Economic Life, Comparative Methods in the Social Sciences, The Changing Academic Market, written with Robin Content, Sociology, and one of my favorite titles, The Social Edges of Psychoanalysis. At the Kluge Center, he's been working on a project that he calls Odyssey, which examines the phenomena of stepping out of the flow of your normal life when you immerse yourself in another set of experiences and what that phenomena is. And he very generously says his time at the Kluge Center is an example of that. However, you're not here to hear about Odysseys because he's not going to speak about this current project, but one that he recently completed. And if we reflect on the titles, I wanted to read them so you would get the titles of his work. You can see that they demonstrate a commitment to using the powers and perspectives of multiple disciplines in the social sciences, along with rigorous research and deep reflection to look at certain real-world problems. And today's lecture is no exception to that, as he speaks about what the social sciences can bring to an understanding of terrorism. The research in this area began with a project conducted by the National Academy of Sciences after 9/11, trying to understand what had occurred. The Academy presented a report, and in agreement with them, Dr. Smeltzer then wrote a book titled The Social Sciences and the Understanding of Terrorism. When I looked at his, some comments he made about the book, I thought it was particularly interesting that in bringing to bear his multiple understandings of disciplines, he can certainly see that although terrorism is a relatively new subject, there are a lot of subjects in the social sciences that have touched on issues related to terrorism, things like social movements and how they developed relationships of terrorist recruitment to religious conversion and other kinds of issues. So I think what we have in some ways is a grand synthesis of years of knowledge and reflection brought to bear on a contemporary issue. And I think you will hear, because I don't know exactly what he's going to say, but I think you will hear a way of conceptualizing the whole issue of terrorism, which is really a somewhat different conceptualization from what we usually hear. So enough of me. Please welcome our friend and colleague, Neil Smelser.
Thank you, Carolyn, for that very generous introduction. I would like to begin by thanking you and the Kluge Center for this fantastic voyage of 3 months that I've been able to spend here in the Library of Congress. It's been kind of a dream experience for a scholar, and the Kluge Center is surely an inspired social creation for a national treasure, really, for the development of scholarship in this country. I also a little bit grateful for scheduling my one obliged event, which is a public lecture, 2 days before I'm leaving. Here you get the opportunity to, social scientists, academics dream of giving a public lecture and then skipping town. It's sort of, you might say, an academic version of cut and run, which we've heard so much about recently. As Carolyn explained, I have spent the last couple of years, even more, in preparing a general book on the subject of terrorism, which explicitly is meant to bring the insights from the social and behavioral sciences generally to bear on the understanding of this phenomenon, from beginning to end, from the genesis of terrorist movements through a variety of mechanisms that facilitate its crystallization and focus on a strategy of violence, and in particular terrorism as a sub-strategy of violence, and then turning around to take a look at giving equal time to the societies on which terrorism is inflicted and the kinds of responses that are developed in those societies. So, as I say, from beginning to end. In the context of and this book is going to be published in the spring of 2007 by Princeton University Press. Keep it in mind, it will be in your local booksellers, readily available, I believe. It's in the course of this work, I had not started out with a particular focus on the issue of terrorist ideology, though I obviously appreciated the power of this particular ingredient in it on the basis of general knowledge. But the presence and features of terrorist ideology of all sorts, not just the ones we are kind of seeing as we look toward the Middle East in contemporary times, but in the history of terrorism, really going back, it can go back a long ways, but I generally have focused on its 19th and 20th century manifestations. The ideological ingredient is so salient and so important, so powerful, that I have decided to give it a lot of time, a lot of attention in the volume itself, and that will be the topic of my remarks today. To give you an idea of how appreciated this is, the Scottish scholar of terrorism, Wilkinson, said the following: every internal terrorist movement or group requires an extremist ideology of some kind to nourish, motivate, justify, and mobilize the use of terror or violence. Now, that's a sort of term that social scientists always sort of shy away from because it's extremely strong historical generalization. And naturally, I was somewhat skeptical about this, but I will have to say in advance that there's in the study of the anatomy of these beliefs, one comes to appreciate the fundamental truth of that kind of assertion. So I will treat and give ample illustrations from a diversity of ideologies that have accompanied the terrorist activities. I'm not going to make distinctions between left and right or between religious and secular. In a way, I'm looking at the generic vectors that appear in these extremist ideologies. And if you look in that way, while religious and political dimensions are important for some purposes, they're not especially important for my purposes. In addition, I'm not treating terrorism as a special cause of terrorist, not treating terrorist ideology as a special privileged cause of terrorism. It's nested into a whole network of causes that give rise to terrorist activity, and it is among them in ways which I hope to illustrate. Now, I will begin with giving you just with what I call an unlikely introduction. It's an ideology, a religious ideology that appeared in the late 19th century among the Sioux Indians in the United States. It's the ghost dance. It's been written up in great detail. It was a movement among the Dakota Sioux and other American Indian tribes that predicted that a time would come when the whole Indian race, living and dead, would be united upon a regenerated earth to live a life of aboriginal happiness, free forever from death, disease, and misery. This version, as identified by Mooney, who wrote a very fantastic monograph on the topic, there would be a Messiah. There would be an earthquake sometime in 1891, and some versions of it picked out July 4th, interestingly, and that it would destroy the earth, and it would destroy the white race, and that the Aboriginal Indians would survive. There would be a Messiah that would appear at the time of the earthquake, identified with Jesus, so there was an element of Christian, and that no human agency was required to bring this about. It was going to happen. However, in preparation for the event, the Sioux were advised to practice honesty and peace and goodwill, even toward whites, but that they were this waiting period for the Messiah to come. And this spread among the Dakota Sioux and took on a somewhat hostile tone under the leadership of Sitting Bull, who the Sioux were generally more hostile toward the whites than other tribes, and this, of course, was what alarmed the American authorities and ultimately led to the great slaughter of Wounded Knee. This was the ghost dance gathering of Sioux who had left and went to Wounded Knee, and the U.S. government sent the military and decimated the gathered group. I'll only say that this movement gathered momentum after a period of very long hardship, of economic hardship, of deprivation of Indian lands, broken treaties and promises on the part of the U.S. government. It was a very deteriorated social situation for the Sioux, and it also operated to give meaning to that and to restore the kinds of imagined happinesses that had existed prior to the coming of the white man. Now, this is an unlikely starting point, and the reason it's unlikely is that, first of all, it's very distant from any kind of contemporary terrorism ideology. Secondly, this group was terrorized rather than terrorist in its fate. However, if we look at the structure and the nature of the ideology, we get striking parallels with what we see and have seen in the history of terrorist movements. They've gone in a different direction. That is to say, I'm meaning to say that not all extremist ideologies of this sort result in terrorism, but inevitably any terrorist activity or movement picks up an ideology of a terrorist sort. So what I would like to stress several features of these ideologies, and in so doing indicate why and in what ways they are so powerful as readying, I'd say, rather than motivational ingredients in the preparation for collective action of various sorts. First of all, I would point out that almost all ideologies get linked up with the terrorist movement are syncretic in character. That is, they combine a lot of very different elements. We even saw that among the Sioux. I mean, they picked up some Christian references, some American references, some traditional Indian references, and they put them together in a given package for a given moment. And that's absolutely typical. I mean, if you go If you take a look at anti-colonial ideologies, which were the basis of a lot of terrorist activity in the middle of the 20th century, you find that they're a mix of indigenous materials and of colonial materials picked up from colonial societies and put together in a unique package. You find this in the in the liberation movements in Latin America in the slightly later period, which were mainly Marxist, but they combined all kinds of sub-varieties of Marxism and local conditions into their diagnosis of the world. The Red Army faction in West Germany combined a kind of Che Guevara philosophy about the Third World, along with recent references to German fascism, and had picked up Herbert Marcuse's theory in the meantime and put them all together in a given and somewhat systematic diagnosis of the illnesses of Western democracy. And we find a mixture of features in almost all of the current Middle Eastern terrorist ideologies of different traditions coming out of different points in the history of Islam, as well as pulling in events and features from the contemporary world. They're all syncretic. Furthermore, this syncretism has a dynamic character because an ideology, it doesn't just sit there. It has to be continually combed over and worked by its proponents. I'm going to talk about the rationalization of ideologies later on. And the rationalization, meaning the continuing generation of new explanations within the framework of the ideology, is absolutely essential if it's going to survive, because it's got to change according to historical conditions. It's got to take both gratifying and embarrassing events into account, and so it has a dynamic of its own, and that increases this syncretic quality. Now, to the features, additional features of ideology, my first general heading is ideology as diagnosis. Ideology typically focuses on something that's wrong in the world, unsatisfactory, whether it's the dispossession of the group that it's being appealed to, or deprivation of some sort, some generalized suffering, and it puts it into it gives it an explanation. It frames it. It identifies and explains what is wrong or what is threatened in the world of believers and hoped for believers. And this way it structures and makes more concrete the diffuse dissatisfaction that an affected population might be experiencing. You just go down the long list of ideologies that have been associated with terrorist activities, you find this structuring of reality. I mean, the ghost dance certainly found it in the ways of the white men as what was responsible for the deterioration of their situation. Nazi ideology picked up the Treaty of Versailles as well as international Jewry as an explanation for the ills that Germany was suffering in the 20s. Radical black movements usually pick up some version of racism as an explanation for their own situation. White supremacist ideologies have great variation, but they generally diagnose various threats to the whites and their welfare that come from Jews, blacks, Catholics, and a government that taxes and attempts to deprive citizens of their arms. So you get this explanation is full of empirical assertions, by and large, not very well tested by scientific standards, but nonetheless an explanation. In addition to being an invitation to believe that this is what's wrong with the world and not to believe something else, because ideologies tend to reject competing explanations for what's wrong in the world, it's also an invitation to experience the affect of outrage. In other words, always framed as though this is unjust, unreal, unnatural, punitive, and so on, so that it's not only the structuring of cognition about what the world is all about, but also the invitation to structure emotions about how to feel about this deprivation or this state of affairs. It's a kind of proto-theory It's kind of an explanation consisting of usually simplified empirical assertions and an intelligible explanation for an asserted state of affairs. This is a tremendous value that ideology does to believers, gives to believers. It gives a kind of coherent view of the world which may likely be both confusing and depriving. And if it's accepted, it becomes a key part in the motivational complex that might lead to action. Secondly, and closely related, is what I call ideology as the assignment of agency and responsibility. It's not just that there's an unfortunate state of affairs, there's somebody or some group or some agent who's responsible for it. And inevitably, this accompanies a terrorist ideology for sure. Now, not all human suffering is always blamed on someone else. I mean, you have mystical traditions which accept a kind of cosmic sadness in the world. You have beliefs that bad luck or this is the way the ball bounces or depersonalized sources of bad fortunes in the world. But by and large, these often turn into the identification of one or more target groups who's regarded as responsible for the unsatisfactory state of affairs. And these are typically accompanied by negative affects, and the agents are typically portrayed as having distinctive characteristics, motives, and hostile intentions. They're stereotyped and being responsible. And they further structure the diagnosis of the world. It's not only a bad situation that can be described, but someone is responsible for the situation. It's quite clear if you go down the list of examples I gave that you find that in anti-colonial ideologies, you certainly found the foreign powers to be generally singled out as being the responsible agents for the suffering of the colonials. Some ideologies contain a kind of renunciation of the idea of agencies. Well, I mean, Marxism, for example, in a way explicitly says, no, it's not it's the capitalist system which is to blame. And that, in a way, the agents are the victims of the system as much as that anybody else is a victim of the system. But nonetheless, in the last analysis, you begin to get identification of capitalists and their agents in the form of police and other as being specific manifestations, specific agents in the devastation of the group. The environmentalist left identifies impersonal forces such as global capitalism as being the source of devastation, but at the same time, it also tends toward concretization of singling out things like the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and international global corporations. As I say, the American right-wing extremist groups have accumulated an impressive array of villains: politicians, intellectuals, communists, anti-racists, women activists, homosexuals, drug addicts, Jews, Zionists, other minorities, immigrants, asylum seekers, Muslims, and foreigners have appeared in the litany of the right-wing reactionary movements in the United States. So that almost always there's a specification of an inimical class, somebody who's responsible. And these specifications tend to generalize. They tend to generalize in many directions. First of all, the enemy or the cause, the agent, is thought to be often tends to be characterized in absolute terms, absolute evil. There's no ambivalence at all in the characterization of these responsible agents. And you find these in all the ideologies. The second tendency is to include as enemies other groups who may be related in some way, symbolically or really, to the principal agents. That is to say, those who espouse the ghost dance ideology picked out not only the whites, but those renegade Indians who joined the whites were equally guilty in their eyes. Right-wing McCarthyites identified not only communists, but also fellow travelers, pinkos, other liberals, and others on the fringes. Contemporary Muslim fundamentalists have developed an ideology that principally identifies Americans, Jews, and Crusaders as the main enemy, but they also include secular leaders in the Middle East who cooperate with the enemies, these apostates that have been picked out in various terrorist ideologies, including Saddam Hussein by many as being one of the enemies. In addition, thirdly, they tend to generalize symbolically and assume a certain indiscriminateness in conveniently identifying whole parties of enemies. That is, for example, just one example, a pamphlet by al-Zawahiri identified the agents who are enemies as Americans, of course, the United Nations, secular rulers of Muslim societies, multinational corporations, international communication systems, international news agencies such as the BBC, and international relief agencies, all in part of the package. So there is a kind of incorporation of larger families of guilty parties, often in keeping with the evolving world situation. Now, I'll pause here and say that just as ideology as a diagnosis readies people for action, so the identification of agency is yet another step in that specification. It really organizes the world in a way that is both meaningful. It gives anger greater structure by converting it into hostility against specific parties. And it invites agents to experience that rage. So we're beginning to get nearer to a kind of a comprehensive justification for some kind of aggression against these enemies, including violence, though it doesn't always turn into that. That's beginning to get closer by way of probabilities. Now, the next element I call ideology as vision. That is, might say a positive counterpart, often a positive utopia that contrasts with the negative utopia that's generated by the identification of suffering and enemies. And this, as far as I can tell, is an almost universal feature of the ideologies that I've examined, so sometimes implicit. I mean, the Ghost Dance, of course, had the world of plenty as they saw it. You know, the restoration of lands and prairie and game and so on, and happiness and the end of conflict. And this is a general feature, of course, of messianic religions in general, which foresee a perfect world at the end of a cataclysmic era. And all these express an ideal vision of a better society and a better life, and accordingly they become part of the motivational package that drives such movements and, in a way, endows them with hope as well as despair. Now, I realize that this is a very daring assertion, so I decided that I would try to take a look at the most unlikely candidate for visionary quality, and that's anarchism, which is generally identified as nihilistic and negative in its implications. And I went back to the anarchist writers like Godwin and Bakunin and others to take a look at really what they were saying. And the aphorism that came to mind was that if you scratch a cynic, you find a romantic. And the same holds if you scratch an anarchist, you also find a romantic. that there's some vision of a society that's freed from the evils that are part of the diagnosis. And Bakunin, then they saw a world of freedom, a world of independence, a world of end of exploitation, that itself also then fed into not an anarchistic, but the communist worldview, which also had a utopian at the end of the road, which was the negative counterpart and an answer to all the specific forms of suffering identified with contemporary capitalist society. It's a mirror. It's a positive mirror of what's wrong, usually. And you find these utopian elements just again and again and again. One of the members of the Red Army faction said, contrary to some views that they didn't have a positive ideology, he said, "We're really looking for a total transformation of all existing conditions, a new form of human existence, an entirely new relationship of people to each other and people to nature." Without a doubt, they're utopian. These ingredients appeared in a lot of the ideologies of the 1960s. It's found in the colonial, the secessionist, and ethno-nationalist movements. And movements of the right that I've been mentioning from time to time also envision some kind of return to an imagined traditional past of white supremacy and pure Christianity. We have the Thousand-Year Reich. We have a kind of parallel formulation in radical cults in Japan that foresaw a cataclysm that would obliterate Jews and Freemasons and financiers and usher in 1,000 years of peace in the world. It's just very, it's just a recurrent ingredient that you get this dialogue between the negative and the positive, and it takes these extreme forms. Now, to get a little bit more subtle in this matter, I've also noted a kind of what I call the core of ambivalence in all these ideologies. And what it means is that in the rhetoric of ideologies, and I'm including all terrorist ideologies, there's a rhetoric that endows the enemy with omnipotence, but at the same time regards the enemy as weak and destructible. It's a double ambivalence. It regards the home group, the believers, as victimized and victims, but at the same time brave and capable of destroying the enemy. So that's what I call a double ambivalence, both toward the enemy and toward one's own group. I mean, I'll just read a quote of from the National Commission on Terrorist Attack that summarized a range of ideological literature coming out of Al-Qaeda. It said, "America had attacked Islam, responsible for all conflicts involving Muslims. They're blamed when Israelis fight with Palestinians, when Russians fight with the Chechens, when the Indians fight with the Kashmiri Muslims, and when the Philippine government fights ethnic Muslims in its southern islands. America is held responsible for the governments of Muslim countries derided by Al-Qaeda as your agents." So you see, it's just everywhere. American influence is just pervasive and elsewhere. At the same time, American society is described as corrupt. I mean, it's preoccupied with materialism, consumerism, homosexuality, or sexuality in general, secularism, and godlessness, and bound to collapse because of its own corruption. The Marxist ideology saw capitalism as a behemoth, on one hand, crushing everything, but at the same time, weak and subject to its own destruction. With respect to the home group, they're almost always characterized as righteous victims. The ideologies of the dispossessed contain themes of certain traumas that have victimized them in the past. Persecutions, injustices, massacres, and martyrs are the recurring themes. And the corollary to this sad history that the heroic group is portrayed as passive victim, but out of this victim comes the power to overcome. to fight. They picture themselves as being omnipotent, contemporary radical Islamic ideologies, the capacity of the righteous fighters to bring down both Israel and the American giant recur repeatedly in it. And this theme is not the most evident. This ambivalent interplay is not the most evident, but it seems to be almost always there. And it's also interesting that this ambivalent interplay doesn't seem to follow the canons of logic as we understand it very much. That is the simultaneous strength and weakness on both sides. But if you understand the dynamics of ideology, well, both of them play a role as an ideological, you might say, resource to account for and to mobilize the faithful. Now I turn to another feature called the strain toward consistency in ideology, and that's where I get to this idea of rationalization that I mentioned. And I think rationalization is a good term because ideologies just don't sit there. Their representatives and their spokesmen are constantly tending to them and tending to their own consistency. So it has rationalization in the sense of becoming more rationalized. This is the Weberian sense of rationalization. But it's also rationalization in the sense of continuously interpreting events that come along that may or may not be embarrassing to the group, or provide evidence that it's embarrassing for the activities of the group. Here's just a few illustrations of how it works. There appeared two explanations in various Muslim nations shortly after September 11th, 2001. First was the assertion that it was the Jews, or alternatively a Jewish plot to attack New York and Washington, intended as a pretense for the United States and Israel to wage further war against the Muslim countries. Second was the assertion issued after the film footage of Osama bin Laden, you know, the famous gloating film of his watching the 9/11, that this was a fabricated Western film. More recently, the same logic of assimilation appeared in the wake of the tsunami disasters in the Indian Ocean, which were interpreted in certain quarters as the tidal waves were caused by an American underwater nuclear detonation designed to kill Muslims and destroy their communities, spread around. So this is rationalization. Now, here's an event that occurs, and it's assimilated to the dominant view that the ideology holds. Coming closer to home, the events of September 11th were interpreted by the Reverend Jerry Falwell as God's way of punishing secular America for its immorality. Gays and liberals were particularly singled out as blameworthy. Now, he subsequently backed off under a siege of outrage at this interpretation. But at the same time, parallel expressions came from the left, that the United States had it coming, that we as a nation have been guilty of atrocities much worse than 9/11, that the Americans created bin Laden during the Cold War, and we're paying the price for it. So this also was less in evidence and tended to be muted in the face of this great passionate national reaction to 9/11. But nonetheless, I read these as ideological rationalizations, or the accumulation of events into the worldview that you are espousing. Terrorist organizations also typically come to a somewhat tortured relationship with the fact that they're killing innocent people. This is a frequent source of explanation of why this really isn't happening, or why they deserve it, or or why the killing of innocents is secondary to a more primary goal that, that the cause calls for. But nonetheless, somehow there has to come to terms with this topic of a more or less universal taboo of slaughtering innocent people or children. And so, again, what I'm talking about is this tendency to rationalize. Rationalization kind of creates this sometimes somewhat strained consistency, but it works all in the direction of a worldview that explains the relevance of everything apparently consistently. The portrayal of an enemy as simultaneously evil and cunning is the most typical formula, because you can explain anything it does as a plot, right? That this isn't what it seems, it's a plot. Turn it around. It's an ingredient that gives the ideology of extremism its frequently attributed paranoid character. Now, this is not to say that terrorists are paranoid clinically and by any means, but the ideology has the apparent capacity through elaboration to claim that nothing is accidental or coincidental, that everything has a purpose, and that purpose is part of a larger design. It's this kind of continuing development of a sometimes quite strained on both sides of the ideological divide of ideological. Now, as ideology goes in this direction and becomes more elaborated and involves more and more assertions and more interpretations, it becomes very complex. And it also becomes something that has to take, it's an object of independent interest and concern on the part of the espousers. In other words, it's not just believing the ideology, it's taking an interest in the ideology becomes an interest. Making the ideologies consistent becomes something to which some energy has to be dedicated in order to get the message through, to reinterpret, not to be embarrassed, to continuously mobilize the faithful, and so on, so that this often can become a distraction to the ideological leaders of spending more time in a way tending to the features of the ideology than to their other features of their own business. Now, I'll cover two more points, and then I think I'll stop and throw it open for discussion. The first general point I'd like to make has to do with the confrontation of ideologies, terrorist and anti-terrorist. As I've been on the terrorist side all the time now, but one of the principles of, and I've been arguing that one of the principles that fosters these ideologies is a shared sense of dispossession and suffering. Now, under certain circumstances, this kind of ideology can also show up in societies being attacked, this a kind of a parallel kind of ideology. Those societies experiencing terrorist attacks or the threat of them, a sense of danger, uncertainty, and accompanying anxiety, there's a favorable breeding ground for ideological reactions there as well. And the paradoxical element is, as these ideologies develop, they develop point-by-point parallels with the very ideologies of the groups that are considered as being inimical, that there's this most interesting structural parallelism. Now, the most vivid illustration of this, of course, occurred during the Cold War in the world antagonism of the United States and the Soviet Union. Interestingly, in the world of terrorism, terrorist activities, a lot of people look kind of romantically back on the Cold War as something that we could really handle, and it was, we understood each other, and messages were clear, and so on. Well, that's not the case. I mean, you lived through it. There was this constant ideological and absolute antagonism that filled the propaganda of both East and West, and both portrayed the other as quite evil, and they portrayed that in the context of their own ideologies, Marxists on the one hand and the ideology of traditional capitalism on the other. Now, in the end, these ideologies were tempered by deterrence and mutual fear, and tended to soften after 1990. We had similar patterns of vilification and polarization develop between enemies in World War II, but once again, after the war was over, there tended to be a kind of muffling, you might say, as new alliances and new international commitments and new international situations arose, these tended to give way to other kinds of ideological positioning. What happened in the wake of September 11, 2001, however, was a kind of full-blown ideological response on the part of that shook this country and to some degree still influences it profoundly. And it came out of the horror of those events. And as I say, it manifested a point-by-point structural correspondence with the fundamentalist ideology that presumably, in the name of which the attacks were presumably made. And here you have, and I'll only indicate, here you get the vilification of the enemy. I mean, and most of the illustrations I could give would be in the speeches in the first 6 months by the administration and particularly the president, as vilifying the outlaws, murderers, barbaric criminals, and killers of innocents. All of these are words. And it focused on the axis of evil. At the same time, as Al-Qaeda was talking about the evil in the peninsula of Muhammad, we were talking about the evil in the axis of evil in a kind of strange dialogue. There was an opposition of absolutes. I mean, it's this either you're with us or against us quote from George Bush, which symbolized this so dramatically, and also when he proclaimed there is no such thing as neutral ground in this conflict. Internationally, bin Laden said 2 weeks later that the world has divided into two camps, the camp of the faithful and the camp of infidels. So you got this dichotomization speaking to each other really within the same period of time. There's also, we tended to get the exaggeration of the agency of the others. And here I would just simply like to give you an example out of my own experience to begin with. I was, in 1964, at the end of the free speech movement in Berkeley, I was recruited by the Berkeley administration to be a special assistant to the chancellor in the area of student political activity. Kind of hot seat, you can imagine. Negotiating with the activists who were still very much with the university and being at the same time in the administration. One thing I observed, and later verified by talking with a lot of activists in the period of non-conflict, was that in my own administrative circles, I observed that we always thought that they were up to something, and that they were planning. And what were the outcomes? We could only figure it out and only second guess and move in there and do something to prevent it. That's what we should be doing. Over on the other side, the activists, steering committees and so on were believing that the administration had a plan to disrupt it. And everything happened was part of that plan to do them in. In reality, the administration was stumbling daily into one error and confusion after another. They didn't know what they were doing. The free speech movement, as it survived, was doing precisely the same thing, triple guessing and confusing each other and stumbling around, and then both sides were wrong. And the truth was they were both kind of crazy with guessing, and in most extreme conflict situations, that's what happened. Nevertheless, the ideology takes the form that those other people are both intelligent and cunning and mischievous in both cases, and both are wrong. It's kind of collective, holistic ignorance that goes up on both sides of the fence. And of course, this was one of the instructive things about the report of the National Commission on Terrorist Attacks, is that they were able to record how the attack on New York and Washington nearly failed 5 or 6 times, ignominiously, and it was in a way almost kind of strange accident that it really happened. And at the same time, our own response to it was equally confused and without structure and so on. Nevertheless, the tendency is to forget that confusion and to tie it up with attributing certainty and agency to the other party. And this leads to kind of a game of last tag between enemies, of getting to designate the other enemy as being really up to something, and therefore justifying your own antagonism toward that enemy, and vice versa. There's also rhetorical reaffirmations of symbols of legitimacy in these periods of extreme conflict. I mean, we saw in the wake of 9/11, we saw the great displays of flags and the reaffirmation of American principles of freedom and justice and democracy. It was kind of an old-fashioned response, you might say, a sort of 4th of July response to the event. And people said that both that Halloween and Thanksgiving and Christmas of that year, 2001, were really like the 4th of July more than any other holiday, because of this great outpouring of patriotic sentiment. And there's also a tendency to surround oneself with legitimizing symbols in this regard. It seems to me that the tendency on the side of terrorist groups to pick up military terminology is an example of this. They are battalions, they are commandos, they are armies, they are soldiers in a righteous cause. And of course, we on our own side had the idea of a just and righteous war on terrorism that's developed and become a word in the language now. Of course, this has been criticized by those who point out the misguided nature of the language of war with respect to terrorism. That is the misguided nature of what they call a war against an abstract noun, with no government to defeat, no territory to conquer, no way to validate the disappearance of the threat, no way to gain full victory. Nonetheless, the language war still persists. And the tendency to identify the other side as rebels, insurgents, terrorists, and guerrillas, and other names is an accompaniment to this. So what I've done is to kind of lay out a structural equivalence here between ideology of terrorism and counter-terrorist ideology. And I should assure you that there is no intention here of arguing for a moral equivalent of these ideologies, just because I pointed out a structural equivalent. We all have our tastes, and we all have our preferences, and all have our positions with respect to where right and wrong is in this world, so I do not wish to be misunderstood as relativizing everything in all senses of the term. But I would like to leave you and open the floor for discussion with a kind of entrapment that emerges under conditions of extreme terrorist threat in democratic societies. And I'll just read what I've written down in this. Democratic polities under threat of terrorist attack are likely to accept extreme and absolute counter-terrorist ideologies because they simplify a complex situation, because they appeal emotionally to a citizenry under threat of attack, and because political authorities typically can shore up their support by adopting or voicing them. Yet such ideologies, at the very least, tend to narrow the range of strategies available to deal with terrorism, and more seriously may spawn overreaction and forms of aggression that may be counterproductive from the standpoint of dealing with the terrorist activities and their potential supporters. I think we've seen a lot of that. To go now directly to an interpretation of a contemporary situation, I think the American government got itself into trouble by taking the ideology seriously, by becoming arrogant and aggressive in the name of that ideology, and by ruling out a whole range of other possibilities of dealing with this terrorist threat. and making serious major mistakes in the name of it. That's the mischievous side of the ideological complex that I've been mentioning. So that, I guess, to return to my original point, that the power of the ideology rests in the fact that it is a structuring device, it's an invitation to believe, it's a resource, and it's a weapon. Those make for a very formidable force in the world of terrorism and defending against terrorism.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.